Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to give you a warm welcome this afternoon for this talk by Dr. Andrew Steele. I'm Denise Waddingham. I'm the director of the British Council here in the Czech Republic. I'm just going to say a few words about our science communication work that we do. So one of the British Council's charitable purposes is to encourage scientific, technological, cultural and educational cooperation between the UK and other countries. And this is because we see science, the pursuit of knowledge and innovation, and the exploitation of this knowledge as being integral to culture. And the sharing of scientific knowledge and ideas to be an excellent way of building trust and understanding internationally, and creating opportunities for people in the UK and other countries. The British Council's work in science and research falls under four main areas: capacity building and STEM education, research collaboration, education, research and analysis, and public engagement activities such as today's talk. Public engagement is an increasingly important aspect of science, and the UK is seen as a world leader. Our work in public engagement includes supporting researchers in showcasing their work internationally, working with the brightest new science talent globally, and engaging the public, like yourselves, directly with scientific subjects that affect our society. I'm delighted that the British Council has been involved in 7 events during this week's Week of Sciences from the Czech Academy of Sciences, and this afternoon's talk is the last of these events. I'd like to say a few thank yous to our partners. So as our main piece of science communication work in the Czech Republic, we run the FameLab competition here every year. We've been running it for the last 9 years in the Czech Republic. FameLab is a partnership with the Cheltenham Science Festival in the UK, and the British Council's been involved since 2007. We've engaged with over 10,000 young scientists and engineers across the world during this time. So our FameLab sponsors and supporters in the Czech Republic are the Czech Centres, the Batia Foundation, of course the Czech Academy of Sciences, the NGO ADETO. I'd like to thank also Dr. Michael Lonsborough, who's here with us in the audience today, who always hosts our FameLab competitions and is one of our judges, and all of our FameLab alumni here in the Czech Republic from the past 9 years. We're very appreciative also of the support we receive from the British Embassy, both for the FameLab competition in the last couple of years and also for this week's Week of Sciences. So just before we hear from Andrew, I'd just like to introduce Lucy Hughes, who's the Deputy Ambassador of the British Embassy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise, and I won't keep you very long because, like you, I'm really looking forward to hearing this lecture. I would just like to say, firstly, well done to the Council for what I know has been a fantastic week of events. The Embassy supports science and innovation in the Czech Republic because I think, as well as the reasons that Denise has set out, we really see this as something where the Czech Republic and the UK excel, and we have a fantastic record of collaboration, and we want that to continue. We want it, in fact, to be even closer in the future. You can see behind you Stolet. So this year we've been in our residence in the Toon Palace for 100 years, and we've had a year-long campaign to showcase the closeness of our relationship and the fantastic things we do together. And we absolutely see science and innovation as being one of the bright spots in that relationship, and we want it to continue to be so. So we've been very happy to be able to support this week's Week of Science again. So I will just briefly have the honour of introducing Andrew, who is a scientist, a writer and a campaigner. And for this audience, worth knowing as well that he was a FameLab, I think, winner in 2012. So this is where you can go when you win FameLab. He did a Ph.D. in physics, but then started thinking about aging and switched his attention over and kind of changed disciplines, which is, again, fascinating to a layperson, and he may talk to us a little bit about that and why aging is something that's become such a focus for him. So, with thanks to all, I will hand over to him.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone, for turning up. I'm going to be asking a very big question today, literally a big question, given the size of this screen. But I thought I'd start with a slightly different big question, which is, if you had to rank the challenges facing humanity in the present day, what would make your top 5? We've got all kinds of risks facing us. We've got climate change, antibiotic resistance, there could be a giant asteroid strike, nuclear war. But I think that one that's often not talked about in this context is our single greatest threat, is the threat from aging. And that might sound really, really strange, because to a lot of you in this audience, you're quite young, aging seems quite boring, quite a distant prospect, something you're not going to have to worry about for another few decades. And it also just seems like a natural part of being alive. But I want to show you that it's an exciting piece of science, and it's an exciting place to work in science as well. I think this could be the most important single scientific discipline in the modern world. As I said, a lot of people think that aging is just a natural process. It's just something that happens to all of us. It happens to our parents, it happens to our pets. Nothing seems to escape it. But what I want to show you is that it's not just a natural part of being alive, when we shouldn't accept it, because it is this enormous humanitarian challenge, actually. We also often think that aging is inevitable. It's just something that we can't do anything about. But actually, modern biology is shining an entirely new light on the aging process and showing us that we can slow down and even reverse aging in animals in the lab. And we're just starting to learn how to do that in humans too. And it's the combination of these two things that's why I think it's the most important field in science. Because not only is it an enormous humanitarian challenge, and I hope you'll come along with me on that idea by the end of the talk, but also we have the biology, we have the science that means we can do something about it. And I think if we can develop treatments, even, dare I ask, can we come up with a way to cure aging, it'll be the biggest revolution in medicine since the discovery of antibiotics. So, let's ask this question. The place I want to start is actually, exactly as you were just saying, with my rather strange career change. I did a degree and then a Ph.D. in physics, but then I decided that I wanted to work on aging research. And the reason that I made that transition was actually due to a graph. Now, I know that's a slightly strange reason to make a career change, but I thought I'd just share that graph with you, because obviously it's got a pretty deep resonance for me. And I think it's rather surprising. It's quite a simple graph. Along the bottom here, we've got how old you are in years, and then up the side, we've got your chance of death per year. Now, everybody knows that old people are more likely to die, but just how much more likely really shocked me. So let's put up the graph. Absolutely amazing. Well, okay, that's scary enough on its own, but let's work through this year by year. So imagine you're born, you're age 0. In your very first year of life, actually, some babies, they're born with congenital problems, or they might get a cancer or a terrible infection. Just under 0.5% of babies in the rich world don't make it to their first birthday. But if you make it past your first birthday, things carry on getting better until the age of about 10. And what happens at the age of 10 is that your risk of death is at the lowest it will be in your entire life. 10-year-olds at the moment have about a 1 in 10,000 chance of not making it to their 11th birthday. And that makes them pretty special. They are the safest humans in the history of our species. But unfortunately, it's all downhill, or rather, on this graph, uphill from there. You can see that by the time you're 18, your odds of death are 1 in 3,000. By the time you're 30, which I was a few years ago, you can see your odds of death are 1 in 1,500. And it's worth just stopping and thinking about what that means. Like, if my chance of death could stay at 1 in 1,500 for the rest of my life, I could expect to live for an average of 1,500 more years. I could celebrate my 1,534th birthday. Clearly, that isn't what happens looking at this graph. After that, it goes up quite rapidly. By the time you're 65, you've got about a 1 in 100 chance of dying. And by the time you're 80, your odds of not making your 81st birthday are 1 in 20. Absolutely staggering. So, as a human, looking at this graph, this is terrifying, right? We've all got this exponentially increasing chance of death coming up on us with varying degrees of distance. But as a scientist, if you can just, stop worrying about it as a human for a moment, this is absolutely fascinating. Because what is it about our biology that means we've got this sudden, huge increase in our chance of death? It all happens, you're pretty much fine until you're 40 or 50, but then suddenly something really severe and significant happens in old age. And it's really striking because there's nothing else you can do that will increase your chance of death as much as getting old, short of throwing yourself in front of a bus or something. No amount of smoking or drinking or overeating. If I was an obese, heavy-drinking, never exercising 30-year-old, I'd still have better odds in terms of odds of death, at least for now, than the healthiest 80-year-old you can imagine. So what on earth's going on, and what can we do about it? The first question we're going to have to ask is, what is aging? And when a lot of us think of aging, we think of something a bit like this. We've got quite a rose-tinted view of it. We think about retirement, having lots of time to take up new hobbies, travel. We think about having wisdom, which we can pass on to future generations, whether they want to hear it or not. And I often think of free chocolate. My grandma once got the mistaken impression that I absolutely loved mint chocolate, which wasn't true, and I got a pile of mint matchmakers big enough to stockpile my way through a no-deal Brexit. But this isn't all there is to do with aging. Unfortunately, we've got this rose-tinted vision, but actually aging looks more like this. It starts with the obvious external signs, things like wrinkles and grey hair. These obviously aren't increasing your chance of death, but they're just a sign of what's going on inside your biology. Then we've got all these terrible diseases that become much, much more likely as you get older. Things like cancer, heart disease, stroke, and dementia are all much, much more likely to hit an old person than they are to affect a young person. We also see all these different kinds of loss: vision loss, muscle loss, hearing loss, memory loss. And this is because all the organs in your body are failing all at the same time, and it means that you gradually lose abilities. And what that really means is a loss of independence. It means that things that you could once do completely on your own as a young person without even thinking about it, it can be a real challenge as you start to get older. And finally, we've got the things that aren't directly connected to the aging process, but aging just makes an awful lot worse. Things like infections and injuries. So, for example, if one of the younger people in the audience gets the flu, you'll be in bed for the week, you'll be feeling pretty grotty, you'll get through 7 packets of tissues, but basically you'll be all right at the end of it. Whereas if an 80-year-old gets the flu, they can go into hospital, they can contract a secondary infection, they can be dead a week later. So there's just this dramatic difference in outcome depending on how old you are when you're subject to external stresses. So, let's go back to a very similar graph to the one we had before, which is, again, your age in years down here and your chance of death up on that side. What I'd like to do now is explain why that chance of death goes up so high from the point of view of diseases. Because this graph is actually very similar to the graph you get if you plot not your chance of death, but your chance of illness in any given year. Cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, all of these things exponentially, rapidly increase at the end of life. And fundamentally, this is why you die when you get old. There's this sort of myth that old people can just die of old age. They die in their sleep without really experiencing any suffering. But actually what happens is you get one of these diseases, and eventually it gets severe enough to kill you. I talked a bit about infections. This horrible mucousy green line represents chest infections, things like flu and pneumonia. We get those things throughout our life, but they're just so much more common in older people. A young person is dozens of times less likely to get the flu, but crucially, I think it's 200 times less likely to die if they get the flu than an 80-year-old is. So that's why, by the way, public service information announcement, if you haven't got your flu jab this year, if you're over 60, do it now. Even if you're not over 60, you're protecting all of your friends and relatives who are over 60 or who are young or who have got some kind of reason their immune system isn't as strong as usual. So please, all go and get your winter flu jab. So we've seen why the chance of death goes up so much as a function of age. Now I'd like to ask the question, is this something that we in the rich world, in the European Union, in the United States, are lucky enough to have? It's a sort of perverse kind of luck, but we're lucky enough to live long enough to experience these horrible diseases, right? This isn't a global phenomenon. Well, I'm going to make this part of the talk a quiz. So what I'd like you to do is all of you are going to stand up, and I'm going to flash up numbers on the board. These numbers are going to be a prediction for global life expectancy, right? So if I flash up a number, and you think life expectancy is less than that number or equal to it, I want you to sit down. So I'm going to give you a starter for free. I flash up 40 years. It's not 40 years, okay? But if you thought it was 40 years, some of you would sit down now. So no extreme pessimists. That is a good start. Does anyone think that global life expectancy is 50 years or less? Anyone for 60 years or less? We've got a few sitting down now. Anyone for 65 years or less? This is like a really morbid auction. Anyone for 70 years or less? 75. Got some optimists down here at the front. Anyone for 80 years? Just for reference, life expectancy in the Czech Republic is 78.3. So if you think the Czech Republic is below average, sit down now. And finally, 85 years, no one's left standing up. The actual answer is global life expectancy, 72 years. Now, almost all of you got that completely wrong. Quite a few people sat down at 60. Most of the rest of you sat down at 65 or 70. There was nobody, apart from these optimists down here, left standing up late in the day. Don't feel too bad that you got that wrong. When they do surveys of these things, only about 30% of people guess life expectancy correctly globally. And actually, that number falls to 20% if you ask university graduates. So it just goes to show that your education doesn't always equip you with the knowledge you need to understand the world around you. You've got to ditch your statistical prejudices to really understand what's going on. But what this means, fundamentally, is that aging is happening all around the world. It's not as though we're in the rich world living long enough to get these diseases. Everybody in every country of the world is living long enough, or almost every country, there are a few, but in most countries of the world are living long enough to experience all these different diseases. And that's why I think this is the world's biggest humanitarian challenge. Let's put an even more firm number on that. Oh, sorry, so this is the graph. At 72 years, you can see you're well into that scary, scary red region. Let's put a firmer number on that. There are 150,000 deaths every single day from a variety of different causes all around the world. Of those deaths, over 100,000 are caused by aging. They're caused by the diseases that aging goes on to cause. Only 50,000 are caused by all other causes put together. So if you're really worried about malaria, infectious diseases, if you're really worried about war or car accidents, you combine all those other concerns together, it's less than half the number of people who die due to aging. So this is why I think aging is the world's biggest humanitarian challenge. So, I'm sorry, I'm going to show you this graph one more time. I did say that I changed my career as a result of it, so it's definitely something that's got deep significance for me. The question is, what can we do? You know, you look at this, you're feeling powerless, you're thinking, oh my God, you know, this is coming up on me in a few decades' time. The problem is that humans have very steep, what's called senescence. We get old very quickly. Every 8 years or so, your chance of death doubles. And that starts out all right. We saw that when you're 30 or 40, it's okay. But when you start doubling the 1% you have at 65, it becomes a big deal. What if we looked to other organisms in the natural world? Because obviously I said our pets age, our farm animals age. What about this thing? This is a small freshwater animal. It's called a hydra. It's about 1 centimetre long, and they're pretty incredible creatures. If you cut them in half, they've got incredible regenerative powers. You end up with 2 hydra. And actually, they have an even more amazing property from an aging point of view, which is that their chance of death as a function of age looks more like this. They've got a 0.2% chance of dying every year, and as far as we can tell, we've been watching them for about a decade in the lab, that chance of death doesn't change no matter how old they are. In fact, we think their chance of death is so low that if we did watch them for long enough, 10% of them would still be alive after 1,000 years. So aging isn't some universal phenomenon. There are some animals who can escape it. The question is, how can we be more like a hydra? And you might be thinking, oh, Andrew, you know, a hydra, it's a pretty weird thing. It's only made of a few cells. It lives in the water. What can we possibly learn from that? Well, this animal is a bit closer to us. You might be thinking, that's a penis with teeth. It's actually a naked mole rat, and these are really incredible creatures. They're about the size of a mouse, and yet they live, when mice live for 3 years, naked mole rats live for 31 years. And I'd like to emphasize, these naked mole rats aren't just living on, you know, in frailty. They look very wrinkly and old at the moment, but actually that's just how they look all their lives because of the place that they live. These animals stay healthy throughout their life. They're still able to run around. They're still able to fight off infection. They're even still able to reproduce until the very last few years of their life. We actually didn't think naked mole rats got cancer at all until recently we discovered there are a handful of cases. But if you think about that again in comparison to mice, mice live 2 or 3 years. They die absolutely full of cancer. So the question is, what amazing thing is going on in the naked mole rat's biology that allows it to live such a long time? That's the question I'd like to try and ask today. So what can we do? How can we all be more naked mole rat? Well, we already know, and we have known for about 100 years now, that the aging process isn't fixed, even in animals that do get old. And the way that we found this out for the first time was in the 1930s, with experiments into a phenomenon called dietary restriction. Now, dietary restriction isn't just going on a diet. It's where you get animals and you feed them dramatically less food. So when this experiment was first done in started in 1932 or 33, I guess, then what happened was they gave these rats that were in the experiment 40% less food. Now that is a lot less food. I think I'm a relatively normal adult human male, and what that means is that I have to consume about 2,500 calories every day. If I was to go onto the same diet as these dietary restricted rats, I'd be eating 1,500 calories a day. So that's not a diet, that's really extreme. It's not just about losing a little bit of weight. But what they found was that these rats that are on dietary restriction, something quite amazing happened. I'm going to show you a graph now called a survival curve, and this is the original data from the paper in the 1930s. Along the bottom, we've got the age of the rats in days, up to 1,400 days long, and up the right-hand side, we've got the survival of those rats. So when it's high, it means a lot of the rats are still alive, and as it goes lower, it means that rats are dying. So let's first show you the survival curve for the rats that were fed ad libitum. What that means is they were at liberty to eat whatever they like. And you can see that after, they start to die slowly but surely, and by about day 900, all those rats are dead. Let's have a look now at the survival curve for the rats that are on dietary restriction. Now, you don't need to be a statistician to see that there's quite a significant difference between those two curves. By the time all the ad libitum rats are dead, half of the dietarily restricted rats are still going. And what's most impressive is they didn't just live an awful lot longer, but they lived a lot longer in better health. This is an absolutely crucial thing. When the rats died at the end of the experiments, they did little tiny rat post-mortems, which probably sounds cuter than it actually is. And they found that the rats didn't usually have any tumours when they were on dietary restriction. The only time they got cancer was when a few of them, right at the end of the experiment, were put back on a normal diet, and suddenly the cancer reappeared. They were still running around in their cages. They had fewer kidney and lung problems. They even had better fur. And I think that, one thing that all of us want to age with is really, really good fur, right? So you can see that this is a global reduction. It's not just a deferral of death. It's a global reduction in the whole aging process. Genuinely fascinating. Now, you might be worried, is this just rats? Is this just some weird experimental quirk? But actually, no, we've since tried it in loads of other species. Yeast and worms and flies and spiders and mice and obviously rats, lemurs and dogs. We've even tried it in monkeys where it might work. That's a little bit of a complicated story. Feel free to ask me questions about that at the end. But the point is, this is a mechanism that occurs across loads and loads of different species. And what that means is it's evolutionarily conserved. It's something that evolution has hung on to throughout our entire time in the whole history of life. And that means that we could hope that it will work in other organisms too. Now, I said it maybe would work in monkeys. I just thought I'd show you this picture because it's so compelling. These are two monkeys, Canto and Owen, who are part of a dietary restriction study at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Does anyone have a guess which do you think is older, Canto or Owen? Everyone thinks Canto's, it's because you're guessing ahead. So actually, it's slightly unfair because Owen is very slightly older. Canto's 25 years old and Owen's 27 years old. Now, this is very, very old for one of these rhesus monkeys. They typically live to about 30 years, so these are like seriously aged monkeys. But if you look at poor Owen, he's got, very baggy skin, he's got skin lesions, he's lost a lot of fur, whereas Canto there looks like a monkey who's far, far younger, even though they are approximately the same age. And of course, you've all worked out that the reason you all guessed that Canto was the older one is because Canto is the one that was on dietary restriction. So this is just really compelling. You don't have to be an expert to look at these animals and realize that they're aging more slowly. So the real question is, could this work in humans? And the answer is, we're not really sure. The ideal experiment would be to get a whole load of humans and to feed them a restricted diet from, say, the age of 20, and then keep on doing that for the whole of their lives. That would be a very long experiment. It would also be quite ethically dubious. So we don't actually know whether it's going to work or not. However, when you do short-term studies, you look at people who do dietary restriction for a few months or a few years, they do look healthier than other people who aren't doing the same thing at the same age. So you do blood tests on them, they have less cholesterol, they have generally lower inflammatory blood markers, so they look like they have the blood test results of a younger, healthier person. So that's good. But I should say, before I recommend you all go home and bin 40% of your food, there are some disadvantages to this diet. Number one, perhaps the most obvious one, is you do feel hungry all the time. You might hope that after a couple of months you get used to eating far, far fewer calories. The reports from people who've actually done it is the hunger never goes away. They also report feeling a lot colder. On a cold day, they have to wrap up an awful lot warmer to make sure they maintain their body temperature. They also have reduced immunity, and there's no point aging more slowly if you're just going to die of the flu after a very short period of time anyway. And finally, a lot of them report having a reduced sex drive. Now, that might be a positive for some people, but I think that most of us would agree that's a negative consequence on your health. In fact, there's a joke that's very commonly made in aging circles, which is that dietary restriction might not make you live longer, but it'll certainly feel like longer. So it's quite hard to recommend this diet for humans at the moment. But maybe there's another way. Maybe rather than stopping eating so much, we could use something called a dietary restriction mimetic. That's a drug that mimics the effects of dietary restriction, but without having to eat less food. And to tell the story of that, the first one, I'm going to have to take you on a slightly crazy journey. We're going to go to an island deep in the Pacific, one of the most remote inhabited places in the world. It's known as Easter Island or Rapa Nui in the native Polynesian. And if you've heard of Easter Island, it's probably because of these guys. These are the Moai statues, enormous human stone statues with gigantic heads, which exist for reasons we don't really know. But back in the 1960s, there was an experiment done where they went to Rapa Nui, sampled a load of bits of soil, and inside one of the samples of soil, they found a bacterium. And that bacterium secreted this molecule, which was named rapamycin, after the island of Rapa Nui where it was discovered. Now, rapamycin started out as an antifungal treatment. They thought it was going to be good for killing fungus like Candida, which is the fungus that causes thrush. But they rapidly noticed when they started doing more experiments on it that it was a powerful immune suppressant as well. So there's no point suppressing your thrush, but then you die of some infectious disease shortly afterwards. So quickly they realized that wasn't a very good use for it. But it has found use as an immune suppressant. So in people who have, for example, an organ transplant, if you get someone else's liver, then your body can identify the liver as a foreign thing inside your body, and it can attack the liver. And what that means is that then you can reject the organ transplant. It's very dangerous. So rapamycin has found use in transplant patients. They also found that it caused cells to grow much more slowly. And one disease that you might think of that involves cells growing far too fast is cancer. And actually, rapamycin has also found use as an anti-cancer treatment. But what's more interesting to us from an aging point of view is that they started doing experiments with yeast and worms and flies. These are very common model organisms, we call them in biology. So a fly, for example, only lives a couple of months. So if you want to do an aging experiment, rather than having to wait for 90 years to find out if your drug works, you can do it in a few months and see what happens. And rapamycin seemed to slow down the aging process in these yeast, flies, and worms. So people wanted to do an experiment in mice. But these things are never easy. So they got all their mice ready. They were in 3 separate labs to try and make it as fair a test as possible. They were going to give them rapamycin in their drinking water. And they started the experiment. And then after the start of the experiment, they took some blood from one of the mice, and they tested it to find out if there was any rapamycin in the blood. And there wasn't any. So what this means is they had to try and reformulate the drug so the mice could absorb it through drinking. And this process turned out to be more complicated than they thought. It took them 2 years. Now, that's a long time in the career of a scientist. It's even longer in the lifespan of a mouse, because mice only live 2 or 3 years in total. So you're giving, so you've got this drug, and you've effectively got a bunch of 60-year-old mice in human years. And a lot of scientists thought this just wouldn't work, because you're giving the drug too late in the process. But they thought, what the hell? We've got the drug now. We've got the old mice. Let's do it anyway. And incredibly, even though they gave this drug to the old mice, the mice lived 10% longer. Absolutely amazing. Now, you might be thinking, great, when are we going to start doing this in humans? And actually, this is a drug that has at least slightly made the transition to human use. Because although we haven't used it for slowing down aging, we have used it for slowing down aspects of the aging process. So there was a paper published a couple of years ago showing that a small dose, not of rapamycin, but of a very similar drug, it's called a rapalog, because it's sort of a drug that's similar, an analog of rapamycin, it would improve the response to the flu vaccine in old people. So one of the problems with giving people the flu vaccine when they're older is they often don't respond to it quite as well as they would when they're young. But if you give them the rapamycin first, their immune system seems to be pepped up. It has its aging slightly reversed, and it improves the response. So it has actually been used in humans. Now, this might all sound very exciting. You might be rushing down to the chemist to try and buy yourself some rapamycin. The problem with rapamycin is the terrible side effects. So I said it's used as an immunosuppressant drug, so that's the first problem. It suppresses your immune system. It can give you diabetes, hair loss, mouth ulcers, slowed wound healing. So that means that if you get a cut, it might take absolutely ages to heal. And the thing that might worry the men most in the audience is it has what's euphemistically described as male fertility problems. When this was done in mice, the testicles of the male mice shrank in size by 80%. So guys in the audience might want to think twice before taking this drug. But what we can hope is, we've seen, that's the effect of giving the mice rapamycin absolutely continuously. If you just give rapamycin for a short time, it improves the response to the flu vaccine. So it might just be a question of optimizing the dose, optimizing how often you take it, and that sort of thing, in order to make rapamycin into a useful drug. But I think it's still fair to say, you might want to at least hold out for some sort of more scientific proof as to how exactly to use this stuff. A more exciting de-armometic is a drug called metformin. Metformin, you might have actually heard of, because it's the most common drug prescribed for type 2 diabetes. So that's the type of diabetes that old people get and you are at increased risk of if you're a bit overweight. And metformin is, there are over 80 million prescriptions written every year in the United States. In the UK, we've been using it since the 1950s. This is a drug we know an awful lot about. We know it's very, very safe. There are very few instances of severe side effects. Now, why do we think this is a de-armometic? Why do we think it might have an effect on aging? So actually, there are a number of little sort of hints that there's something going on with metformin. And it starts with another one of these survival curves. So this is an experiment that was done in the UK. They were looking at people's medical records. And they were actually trying to judge whether metformin or another kind of diabetes drug called sulfonylurea was better at treating diabetes. So they did this survival curve again. So we've got this time in years, not days, because we're talking about humans. And up on the right-hand side, we've got how many people were still alive after that period of time. So this is the curve for the people who are taking sulfonylurea. These are all people who are in their 70s, by the way, so the fact that a quarter of them were dead after 5 years shouldn't worry you too much. These are the people who are on metformin, so that's obviously good news. It looks to me, this is not a medical recommendation, but metformin looks like the best diabetes drug if you chat to your doctor about it. But then, interestingly, they also included a control group of healthy people who were matched in every way to the patients who had diabetes, but didn't have diabetes. Everything else about them was as close to the same as possible. So they didn't have diabetes, and they weren't taking metformin or these sulfonylureas. And their survival curve looked like this. So what's amazing is, it's not by very much, but those non-diabetics are living less long than the diabetics who are taking metformin. And that's crazy, because the diabetics taking metformin, they have diabetes. They've already got quite a serious age-related disease that has a knock-on effect on the health of your heart. There are hints that it might reduce the rate of heart disease, might reduce the rate of cancer. And so the suggestion is maybe it is one of these dietary restriction mimetics that slows down the whole aging process. And that's the idea behind a trial called TAME, which stands for Targeting Aging with Metformin. Scientists do love their acronyms like that. Headed by a guy called Nir Barzilai in the United States. It's just got funding, so this is exciting, hot-off-the-press current news. They're going to get 3,000 older people. They're going to split them into 2 groups, give 1,500 of them nothing, and 1,500 of them metformin, and they're going to watch them over a period of time. And what they're going to watch them for is whether they get cancer, whether they get heart disease, whether they get diabetes, whether they get dementia. And if the group that are taking the metformin get those diseases later or in fewer numbers, then maybe metformin is doing something to the aging process itself. Now, this trial is at once absolutely revolutionary and a little bit boring. So I'm going to tell you the reason it's a little bit boring first. It's just that survival curve that I showed you. Like, the difference between the metformin takers and the non-metformin takers is a few months, really. It's not a huge amount of time. And maybe if they're healthy rather than diabetic, it might be a bit better. But this drug is not going to cure aging. It might be worth taking, but it's not going to be something that revolutionizes the state of the world. What is revolutionary about this trial is that it's the first ever trial of a drug specifically to target the aging process and not to target one of the diseases that we associate with aging. And the reason it's really important is actually quite a boring regulatory reason. Imagine you're a drug company and you've got this amazing new drug that you think is going to cure aging. It's very, very hard to get it approved anywhere in the world, because what medical regulation authorities want is a drug that treats a particular disease. And they'll only let you give that drug to people who are already sick. But what's exciting about this trial is they're going to be giving metformin to people who are quote-unquote healthy as far as the medical system is concerned. The only thing they've got wrong with them is that they're getting old. And so this is the first time ever that a trial approved by the regulators in the US is going to try this out. And so the idea is not to, as I say, revolutionize the world of medicine, but to show a first baby step that will pave the way for future, more exciting drugs. In fact, that's the reason metformin was chosen. It isn't because it's going to be hugely exciting, but because, like I said right at the start, it's very safe. We know there aren't, or we really, really hope there aren't going to be any severe side effects. Because the last thing you want is to give rapamycin to a load of people. You might find that it's a lot safer, but everyone comes in complaining of terrible hair loss and other problems I won't mention again, because that's going to completely, potentially derail the whole of aging science for a very long time into the future. So, as I said, probably wouldn't recommend dietary restriction. We're not quite there with dietary restriction mimetics yet. But the real problem with dietary restriction as an aging scientist is it's incredibly general. When you look at a mouse or a rat that's taking one of these drugs or has had its diet reduced, everything about its metabolism, everything about its biology changes. It's very hard to work out, what exactly is driving the aging process if all you can do is slow the whole thing down at once. So I'm going to go back to that slide where I showed you all the different things, what is aging right at the start. And if you look at this slide, you'll notice I've cheated a bit, because every single one of these words is a massive category of things, right? Cancer, there are hundreds of kinds of cancer. Vision loss, you can lose your vision in loads of different ways. You can get cataracts, which is where the lens of your eye clouds up. You can lose cells on the back of your eye and age-related macular degeneration. So there are loads and loads of different ways all these things can happen. If I was to write this slide for real, it would be bigger than this room, and it would be in really tiny text to list all the tens of thousands of things that can go wrong with your body. But as a biologist, we can look at the difference between old and young animals, and we can make a much more interesting list. And this is it. These are the 9 things that we think are the primary drivers of the aging process. They're sometimes called the hallmarks of aging. And I've not got time, you'll be relieved to hear, to go into every single one of these. And some of them have got quite complicated, long biology words in them. But the point is that these are much more fundamental changes. These are the changes that are driving all those diseases that we looked at on the previous slide. And this is why I think that treating aging could be the biggest revolution since antibiotics. Because if we can come up with a drug that improves the function of your mitochondria, for example, as you age, it's not just going to impact on one disease. It's going to impact on many diseases at once, and it's also going to impact on the things we don't currently treat. Things like frailty and loss of independence that medicine currently doesn't really deal with. So as I said, I've not got time for the whole list. I'm just going to go through these first top 2 items. And I've chosen these because, well, the first one, when you say you're writing a book about the biology of aging, one thing people often ask is, has that got something to do with telomeres? And the answer is, maybe. So, this is an absolutely beautiful picture. I'm very jealous of microscopists who get to do talks because they get to put these lovely pictures up all the time. This is a picture of a load of chromosomes. So this is the way your DNA is stored on the inside of your cells. And these blue bits here, they're the chromosomes themselves. They're just wrapped up DNA in these sort of X shapes. This is what your DNA looks like when a cell is about to divide. And you can see on the ends of those chromosomes, there are these red and green dots. And you can think of them as start and stop. They're the ends of the chromosomes. And they act as a sort of protective cap on the ends of your DNA to stop it getting damaged. So if we were to zoom in on one of those red or green dots, it would look something like this. Now, you might know that DNA is made up of 4 different letters, A, T, C, and G. And you can write billions and billions of different, effectively, words with those 4 letters. But the telomeres are really boring. They're just TTA, GGG, TTA, GGG, TTA, GGG, hundreds or thousands of times, this repeated load of nonsense. So why does our DNA have this repeated nonsense at the start and end of every single one of our chromosomes? Well, actually, it's to fix a really stupid mistake on the part of evolution. And to show you what that is, I've spared no expense with this graphic. This is made by the same software that Pixar used to make Toy Story. This is a piece of DNA, I'd like you to imagine. Now, DNA, you might know, curls round in a double helix structure. Didn't have the budget for that. So what I've got instead is 2 straight lines. Imagine I've uncurled the DNA, okay? And when your cells divide, that DNA has to be copied. And you might know that DNA, each strand is a mirror image of the other strand. And what that means is that you can use one of them to make a perfect copy of the other. So let's just concentrate on what happens on a single strand when the cell is replicating. This little enzyme comes in called DNA polymerase, and it zips along the length of the DNA, making this copy. But when it gets to the end, that happens. Evolution has made DNA polymerase that's broken. It can't get all the way to the end of a DNA molecule. In fact, it gets to the end and it just leaves a tiny bit off. The analogy is, imagine you're trying to build a wall, but you're also standing on the wall at the same time. You lay your brick, and you lay your brick, and you lay your brick, and by the time you get to the end, you can't lay a brick where you're standing, and so it's not possible to quite finish the wall. So that's how DNA is replicated by evolution. And if that DNA was important DNA, if that was part of one of your genes, that would be incredibly bad news, because it would mean that your genes are gradually being eaten away every time one of your cells divided. So evolution thought, I know, why don't I just stick some repeated nonsense on the end of that chromosome? And that means when that gets chopped away, it doesn't matter. And all I have to do is trim back the other chromosome to be the same length. Everything's fine. The genes, the important blue bit of the DNA on this picture, is still intact. And that means the cell can go on dividing, it can go on working, doing whatever it does. Now, that might seem like an obvious cause of aging. Because every time your cells divide, and your cells are dividing all the time to grow, to replace cells that are being lost, they lose a tiny bit of one of these telomeres. And if this stuff isn't replaced, then eventually you're going to run out of that telomere. And that could, as I say, potentially be one of the things that drives the aging process. Incredibly, we know there's an enzyme called telomerase. And what telomerase does, it was discovered in the 1980s and won a Nobel Prize 10 years ago this year. And what it does is it takes those repeats, those TTA GGGs, and makes more and more and more of them so it can extend your telomeres. Now, unfortunately, telomerase is deactivated in most adult human cells. So it's turned off, it's not used. And that might seem stupid, right? Because our cells could just turn this on and extend the telomeres again. The reason it's deactivated is because of cancer. So I said about cancer earlier, it's a disease in which cells divide and divide and divide. They divide out of control until eventually they're divided so many times that they form a tumor, and if that tumor gets big enough, it can go on to kill you. So that means if a cell can divide as many times as it likes, that can spell trouble. And so the reason that telomerase is disabled in a lot of our cells is it sort of acts as a brake. If a cell divides too many times, its telomeres get too short, then that sends out a warning signal, and it can tell the cell there's something wrong. And that means the cell can commit suicide or it can become senescent. Hold that thought, we'll talk about that in a minute. But it means that the cell doesn't turn into a cancer, basically. And in fact, almost all cancers, 90% of cancers, find a way to reactivate telomerase, to turn this telomerase back on, allow them to extend their telomeres, and divide as many times as they like. So it seems like if you turned on telomerase, then that would produce a huge cancer risk. And so they did this experiment, thankfully, in mice rather than in humans. They gave them an extra copy of the telomerase gene, which was on the whole time, and what happened was cancer. And this was a real, I guess, a sad moment in aging biology, because there had been a whole decade in the 90s when we thought that telomeres and telomerase were going to solve everything. You put them into a mouse, the mouse gets loads of cancer, and who doesn't love a story when scientists turn out to be wrong? So this went around the media, telomeres, they were promised as this cure-all, but it turns out they actually just cause cancer. But there was one scientist in particular, a woman called Maria Blasco, who I think has held the faith with telomerase for the last couple of decades. She's kept doing experiments on it. One of the experiments she did was to get some mice and not just give them telomerase, but give them some other genes as well. Don't worry about the names, P16, P53, ARF. Where do biologists get these ideas from? The point is that these three genes are anti-cancer genes. They're genes that encourage cells that are about to turn into a cancer to instead commit suicide. And so when you put the telomerase in with the anti-cancer genes, you get a completely different result. The mice live 40% longer. And not only that, they do so with no increased risk of cancer. Another exciting experiment done in 2012, they got mice, but instead of adding the telomerase into their genome, so the DNA that they're born with, they gave them a virus, which makes a sort of temporary copy of it. And again, this is an exciting result. The mice lived 20% longer. They had no extra cancer. And even better than that, they lived longer in good health again. So they did the same kinds of experiments. They had higher bone density, plumper skin. I have to read these off because every mouse experiment does really random, different tests. They also had better performance walking a tightrope, because that's something that you do to find out how a mouse is doing in terms of aging. So telomeres have this incredible story. They started out as what we thought would be the key to immortality. They had this sort of really low point in the early 2000s when we thought they were just to do with cancer. But I think now these experiments in mice give us a bit of cause to hope that they might have a great deal more potential. Now, I don't think that all of us should be going and getting some gene therapy to give us telomerase right now, but we're certainly going to know more about this in humans soon, because, and this is a theme that sort of recurs whenever you're talking about the aging process. There are people who have particular aspects of aging accelerated. There's a disease called dyskeratosis congenita. Sorry, that's another real mouthful. But it's a disease where people are born without enough telomerase. And they experience something that looks a lot like accelerated aging. They get very blotchy, thin skin, they start losing their hair very young, and they eventually die, ironically enough, actually of cancer quite a lot of the time, often in their 40s and 50s. Now, this is a really serious disease, and that means that if you've got a gene therapy for telomerase, for example, it might be a bit risky to give it to healthy 30 and 40-year-olds, but maybe you might want to give it to someone with dyskeratosis congenita to find out if it can help extend their telomeres. And at that point, maybe if it works in them, you might start thinking about giving something similar to the wider population. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. But as you can see, when people ask, is it all about telomeres? The answer is it's a little bit more complicated than that, but maybe. So finally, in terms of the science, I'd like to talk about what I think is the most exciting thing in aging research, about these aged senescent cells. You might have noticed I've been using the word senescence quite a lot throughout the talk, by the way. I talked about, did I actually mention this? Those hydras that have the same chance of death throughout all time is called negligible senescence. So that means their chance of death doesn't increase as they get older. Similarly, senescent cells, senescence just comes from the Latin word meaning old. And these senescent cells, they accumulate in our bodies, and they seem to cause an awful lot of age-related diseases. And we've discovered an awful lot more about them in the last few years. But actually, they were discovered a very long time ago. They were discovered in the 1960s by a guy called Leonard Hayflick. He was looking at cells called fibroblasts in a dish, and I'm going to show you what he discovered now. Now, this is a cartoon of a cell. I don't know why scientists always call pictures like this cartoons, because they're not very funny. The reason I'm calling this one a cartoon is that this is not what a fibroblast looks like. This is just a random picture of a generic cell. So imagine you've got a cell on your Petri dish in the lab, and you're watching it. What that cell will do is it will divide. And when that cell divides, it goes from one cell into two cells. And then after a little bit more time, those two cells will divide, and two cells becomes 4. And then 4 cells becomes 8, 8 cells becomes 16, and so on and so on. So as cells divide, this whole process is called a population doubling, because every time the population of the cells multiplies by 2. But what happened as Hayflick continued to watch, imagine we came back 50 divisions later. Oh my God, what's happened? Every cell has turned into a default PowerPoint shape. Now, again, this isn't exactly what Hayflick saw down his microscope, but the cells did look really weird. They had this strange sort of splayed out shape, and he also noticed that they'd stopped dividing. So he dubbed these cells senescent cells. He thought these cells are getting old. And the question is, these are old cells in the dish, but are they actually old cells causing old organisms? So let's see what happens in a bit more of a sort of natural context inside the body. This is a cell. As you can see, its nucleus has got a red alert going on inside it. It's a cell that's misbehaving. And there are a number of different ways that a cell can misbehave. We've actually already met one of them. That's that its telomeres can get too short. And when those telomeres get too short, the cell says, oh no, I've divided too many times, maybe I'm at risk of becoming cancer, let's chill out and put a bit of a lid on things. Another thing that can happen is the cells can get DNA damage. So you might know that cancer is caused by mutations, changes in your DNA. If you get too many of these changes, a cell can go, hang on, there's loads of changes in my DNA. Again, it looks like I'm turning into cancer. Maybe I should just chill out and see what happens. So you get these sort of stressful changes that happen, and the cell is misbehaving. Then it's got two choices. One thing it can do is a process called apoptosis. That's a Greek word, so it's got a silent P, which is a bit of a shame because I think it's a very accurate description of what the cell does. The cell literally does go pop. The cell just breaks up. A load of suicide genes get activated. The cell breaks up into loads of tiny pieces, and it basically just gets cleared away. So it's a very sort of simple, clean way to end a cell's life. However, the alternative path, and we're not even entirely sure why this sometimes happens, is that cells can go senescent. They can say, okay, for some reason, I can't do apoptosis. So the next best thing, if I'm not going to die, at least I'm going to stop dividing because that's going to stop me turning into a cancer. And the problem with senescent cells is they don't just sit there doing nothing, which I guess would be bad enough in itself because it means they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing in the tissue. But they also give off a cocktail of nasty chemicals, which is known as the SASP, the senescence-associated secretory phenotype, another mouthful. So senescence-associated means it's associated with senescent cells. Secretory means they sort of splurge these things out, and phenotype is just a thing that cells do. So it's this senescence-associated load of chemicals that come out. And the purpose of these chemicals, they're like distress flares. They're molecules that say, help, I'm over here, I'm in trouble, come and sort me out. And the message that they're sending is to the immune system. And so the immune system detects these chemicals, it comes in, and it gobbles up all of the SAF, gobbles up the senescent cell, and everything's fine again. Everything's as good as it could be. And when you're young, that makes an awful lot of sense. But the problems start when you become old. So when you're old, the first thing you get is more of these misbehaving cells. And the reason for that is, your cells have shorter telomeres, they've divided more times. You've been alive longer to accumulate more DNA damage. You've been smoking and drinking and breathing and eating and all these things that cause the DNA in your cells to get damaged. And so you're just accumulating more of these cells that need to have something done. So that means you get more apoptosis, you get more cells committing suicide, but you also get more cellular senescence. And that means you get a load of these SASP molecules going out into the rest of the body. But then there's also another problem. I heard a very nice analogy from one of the scientists I interviewed for my book, Richard Farragher. He said that when you're young, you call it your immune system, and it responds immediately. When you're old, you call it your immune system. It's more like calling your bank. And they say, your call is very important to us. You're number 57 in the queue. And the immune system, it's a bit distracted, it's got other stuff on, and so it just zooms away, completely ignores the senescent cells, and they carry on sitting there, giving out this toxic cocktail of molecules. So all of these processes get worse when you get old, and that's why you start to accumulate these senescent cells. This is all very nice and theoretical, and we've seen some lovely cartoons, but what actually happens inside real organisms? Well, this is a lovely young mouse. You can see it's got lovely young cells, but if we let that mouse age, what happens is that a very small percentage of its cells will turn into senescent cells. Now, the first sort of smoking gun, the suspicious thing about these, is that they appear at the sites of age-related diseases. They appear at the site of cataracts. They appear at the site of an age-related disease called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF, another mouthful, it's just a lung disease that old people get. Arthritis, which is where you get sort of stiff, painful bones and joints as you get older. Ironically, senescent cells are actually found near cancer as well. Even though they exist as a cancer defense mechanism, if you get enough of them, they can encourage other nearby cells to turn into cancer. And then not just that, but even more ironically, they can generate more senescent cells. So that SASP I was talking about can encourage other cells to turn senescent. So you've got this sort of recursive, terrible problems that they start causing. But it's all very well and good to look at these and say they increase as mice get older, or as humans get older even. But are they actually a cause of aging? Because it could be an effect, it could be a bystander that's just happening at the same time. So the killer experiment for this was they got some mice, they got some senescent cells and they injected a young mouse with senescent cells. And they injected 500,000 cells. Now, that might sound like a lot of cells, but a mouse has probably got about 5 or 10 billion cells in its body in total, so it's less than 0.01% of its cells are senescent. And that was enough to impair the mice physically. So it seems as though these senescent cells, even though they're very small in number, because they secrete this toxic mix of chemicals, they can have a much bigger effect than they'd be able to have on their own. So back to these old mice, what you can do is give them something called a senolytic drug. This is a drug that preferentially kills the senescent cells whilst leaving as many as possible of the normal cells unharmed. And that's been done. What happens is that the senescent cells get deleted, other normal young cells grow to fill their place, and the mice basically get biologically younger. It's exactly the same story as we've had with a lot of these other aging treatments. It's not just that they live longer, but they do. They also have a number of other positive age-related changes. They get fewer cataracts, they have stronger muscles, they have a stronger heart, they're even more curious. So this is another fascinating test you can do with mice. If you put a young mouse in a maze, it will explore that new environment, try and find out where it is. But if you put an old mouse in a maze, they're often quite anxious, maybe they're just a bit bored with life, and so they just sit there, don't do a very great deal. And if you remove the senescent cells from an old mouse, it regains some of that youthful curiosity, which is absolutely incredible. It really is a global reversal of aging. And also, they get better fur. I don't know why every mouse paper reports that the mice have better fur. They clearly think we're very bothered about that. But this is just a really incredible treatment. And what's even more incredible is that we can use this stuff in humans. So the drug that was identified for use in mice, or it was a combination of drugs. One's dasatinib, which is a human-approved drug that's used for chemotherapy, and one is quercetin, which is a flavanol molecule. It's often used in sort of vitamin supplements. And if you want to get it out of your food, apparently there's quite a lot in kale. But if you mix these two chemicals together and give it to a mouse, then it kills these senescent cells preferentially. And because those are both things that we can give to humans, it's been very quick to translate this work from mice into human trials. Now, I mentioned that this is a common theme in aging research. It's not always used for aging initially, but it's used for diseases that are related to that particular cause of aging. So there are currently trials going on in humans trying senolytic drugs for IPF, that's the lung disease I mentioned, for arthritis, and indeed for age-related macular degeneration, this cause of blindness that you get because of the cells dying in the back of your eye. So this is probably how it's going to start. We've had these, they're called phase 1 trials. They're very early stage. They're just testing for the safety of those drugs. They're not really testing to see whether they're effective or not, but they're moving on rapidly to the next stage. And once we've established that they're safe, that they're effective in people with these particular diseases, I think that's when things really start to get exciting. Because rather than saying, going to your doctor and saying, doctor, I've got a really bad knee, I've got arthritis, can you prescribe me a senolytic drug? Maybe at some point, maybe even in the next 5 or 10 years, if these results happen quickly enough, you'll go to your doctor and you'll say, I'm perfectly healthy. The only problem is I'm 50 years old. And that means that I've probably accumulated enough of those senescent cells in my body that it's worth me taking one of these drugs. Take a short course of them, might last a few weeks, clear out all of those senescent cells, and reverse that aspect of the aging process. And what's really cool about that is it then prevents this whole load of age-related diseases all at once. So it's an idea of preventative medicine. Rather than treating the end stages of age-related disease like we do now, you'd get in early. You'd come up with preventative medicines that can treat lots of the diseases at once. So this is really genuinely exciting. This is something to watch. And every time I do this talk, I have to slightly update this section because the field of senolytic drugs is just moving so quickly. And I think this is how we're going to cure aging, right? We're going to look at those 9 different causes I talked about. I just talked about telomeres and senescent cells now, but there's all those other things I mentioned, DNA damage and mitochondria and all that other stuff. We'll come up with medicines that can treat any one of those individual causes. And then by combining all of those medicines together, we can make a serious dent in the aging process itself. We'll probably end up adding more things to those lists. Adding more things to that list. We'll probably find that some of those things aren't such fundamental causes of aging. We'll probably find that some of the treatments don't work. But the idea that all 9 of those things, which we have multiple ideas of how to deal with, could come up with nothing is just completely impossible to believe. So I think that's how we're going to do it. We're going to take these things out one thing at a time, reverse aspects of the aging process in mice and then in humans, and hopefully one day come up with treatments for the entire aging process. But I thought I'd finish by asking what's actually a slightly weird question for a science talk, which is the question of, should we cure aging? Now, I think this is really, really bizarre, and the reason I think that is imagine that I'd just given a talk about cancer drugs, or imagine I'd just given a talk about malaria. nobody, none of you would stick your hand up at the end of the talk and say, but Andrew, now you've developed this amazing new treatment for malaria, won't people live longer, which is going to lead to overpopulation, which is going to cause the climate crisis? But as soon as you talk about aging, even though all I'm interested in is treating those diseases that happen at the end of life and doing so effectively, that's always the first question I get asked. So I thought I'd try and get a bit of my defense in first by showing you some of the reasons that I'm not too worried about age-related research. And I want to come across not as defensive here. I'm actually quite hawkish about this. I've thought about this quite hard. I've written a whole chapter of my book. I've talked to philosophers. And I think curing aging is an absolute no-brainer. I think there is no ethical objection to curing aging that stands up to any kind of scrutiny. As soon as you think about it for a short time, the objections just seem to crumble. And this isn't to dismiss anyone's fears, because I know that when you come at this for the first time, it does sound weird. Aging is a natural part of human life as it exists at the moment. But I think if you go away and seriously think about what aging is and the consequences of the aging process, then it is an absolute no-brainer. I'd like to start by talking about what is the most common objection, as I mentioned, is overpopulation. So people are really worried that if people live for a much, much longer time, because we've managed to treat the aging process, the Earth's already full, right? We're already doing huge damage to the climate, huge damage to other aspects of the environment. Isn't it just going to be made an awful lot worse by sorting out aging? Well, let's tell you the story so far. Back in 1999, the world's population exceeded 6 billion people. In 2011, it exceeded 7 billion, and at the present day, we're sort of edging towards that 8 billion mark. So the world's population is getting bigger and bigger all of the time. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, that is the UN's projection. That's what's called the United Nations Medium Variant Population, and that's just their sort of best guess about what's going to happen at some point in the future. And they think that by 2050, the population will be about 9.7 billion people. Now, remember that I'm interested in trying to slow down the aging process, make people live longer, reduce the number of deaths in the world. I don't know how long this science is going to take. I think it's exciting. I think it's going to happen soon, but I'm not going to tell you that in 10 years' time, X is going to happen because, it's a foolish scientist who makes predictions like that. So I thought, let's go with something completely ridiculous. I'm going to imagine that we cure death, not just aging, but all death. No one is going to die on the planet Earth after the year 2025. Now, this is optimistic, I'll give you that, but let's just roll with it and see what happens. This is the UN medium variant population projection, but with nobody dying after the year 2025. And the population in 2050 will then be 11.6 billion. Now, that does sound like a reasonable amount more. It's almost another 2 billion people. But actually, obviously, if you do the maths, it's only a difference of about 20%. Now, I would happily work 20% harder to cure or to solve problems like climate change if it meant that we'd cured all of these terrible diseases of aging, if it meant we didn't have dementia anymore, we no longer had to cope with the horrible loss of cancer. And it's worth bearing in mind, 20% harder is actually the sort of the worst case scenario if you're a population pessimist. I hesitate to call it the worst case. Curing death is the worst case scenario. It seems like a bizarre thing to say. I think it's the best case scenario. But if you're really worried about population, this is the worst it can possibly be. If aging science is less effective than entirely eradicating death in 5 years' time, then we're going to have a smaller problem to deal with. And it's also worth noting, these are the high and the low variants of the UN population projections. So there's a large uncertainty. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen in future. And these differences are made not by changing the death rate, but by slightly tweaking birth rates. So slightly tweaking birth rates can have the same effect, or very nearly the same sort of size of effect, as entirely eradicating death. So I think this means that we really shouldn't be worried about the population consequences of sorting out aging. There are also obviously a load of other ethical issues that you could raise, quite legitimately. And I think there's a sort of general framework with which you can think about these. The first is that what I'm proposing isn't actually such a radical change. Life expectancy has been going up for about the last 2 centuries by 3 months a year, every single year. It's astonishing. If you look at the line, it's so straight. Every single year, no matter, the country with the longest life expectancy in the world gets 3 months older, which is absolutely incredible progress. It means that life expectancy has doubled from 40 in 1830 to 80 now. So we've literally doubled what it means to be human. Like a lot of the people in this room would be statistically dead in the 1800s, and yet you're living on, enjoying life. So we've already undergone this enormous change, and obviously it's caused changes in how society works. We've got pensions now, and we've got universal healthcare. Loads of things have had to be changed, but we've adapted, we've made it work. It's also important to remember that this isn't going to be some instant immortality pill. I'm not going to cure death in 2025, much though I'd like to. Because it's going to be a lot of incremental small changes. You know, first of all, we'll develop some senolytics, and the first senolytic drugs won't be 100% effective, but they might add a couple of years to life expectancy. Then we might come up with a way to lengthen telomeres safely in humans, and that might add a couple of years more. It's not as though we're ever going to come up with a pill that just stops people dying altogether. It's going to be a gradual process, just like the development of all medicine has been. And even if we did cure death, again in this ridiculously extreme circumstance, we're not going to have any 200-year-olds for about 100 years, because, you know, nobody's older than 100 approximately now, which means we're going to have an awfully long time for society to adapt to these huge changes. I think the other aspect that people often neglect is there are a lot of positive aspects to curing aging as well. Firstly, there's all the death and disease and suffering, which I've told you about in plenty of detail already. But also, you know, imagine you lived to 150 or 200. You could have multiple careers. You could, you know, quit your job at 60 and go back to university and retrain and have an entire current length of career ahead of you. I think it's a really important feminist issue, which might sound like a bizarre thing to say, but if you think about reproductive aging, you know, women basically can't have babies after the age of about 40 or 45. If they had no reproductive aging and could have a baby whenever they liked, they'd be much more able to compete with men in the workplace. So there are all these positive side effects of treating the aging process that people often forget because they're worried about problems like overpopulation. And then the final question I like to ask myself when I'm thinking about an objection to aging is to reverse the whole question entirely. So we live in a society at the moment where aging is the norm, where everybody we know, everyone since the dawn of human history, most animals in the animal kingdom age. We've never known any different. But imagine you lived in a society where aging didn't exist. And the question you have to ask yourself is, if you were faced with this problem, if you were faced with, you know, too many humans on planet Earth, would you invent aging to solve that problem? Would you invent 100,000 people dying every day and suffering for years and years beforehand with loads of different diseases? Would you invent frailty? Would you invent, you know, grandparents forgetting the names of their grandchildren because they're suffering from dementia? I just think that the consequences of curing aging are smaller than the huge positive consequences, the outweighing consequences of all the medical, social improvements that we get by going through with this process. So what I really want to do is drive forward these treatments that reduce the rate of aging, that drive us towards negligible senescence, to make us a bit more like that hydra with a flat chance of death, independent of how old we are. And I hope that some of you in the audience, you know, maybe you're students at school, you'll think about doing a biology degree, doing a biology Ph.D. and helping us with this research. But it's really important for everyone to be involved in this conversation. This final slide is just about why. This is a slide to show you how the cost of chronic disease compares to the amount that we spend on aging research. This is based in the United States. So every single year, these chronic diseases cost an awful lot of money. Cancer costs the US economy $280 billion every year. Heart disease, $200 billion. Stroke, $110 billion. Dementia, $270 billion. Now, this isn't even all the diseases of aging. These are just my favorites is probably the wrong word, but it's the ones that I keep referring to. So the total cost of aging is well in excess of $1 trillion. $1,000 billion. It's hard to get your head around an amount of money that huge. And yet, the amount of money that's spent on the National Institutes of Aging, well, it's this thing over here. That little square, that's not a bullet point. That square is in proportion to the size of the amount of money that we spend. And actually, the US is almost unique in the world in having a national institute that focuses solely on the aging process. If you try and do this in the UK, for example, where I've done it, nobody knows how much you spend on aging research because the government doesn't even consider it a category. So there's this huge political, social battle that we've got to fight. We've got to convince our friends, our colleagues, our politicians that this is a hugely important thing. Even from a purely economic perspective, if we put a bit more into aging research, we could massively reduce the cost of all these chronic diseases. And that's before you even start on the human cost and all the suffering. So I really hope that you'll go out and, you know, tell everyone about this really important message, because if we're going to realize some of the potential of these anti-aging drugs, we're going to have to make some pretty big changes as a society in terms of how much we fund. So that is what I'd like to talk to you about today. That is me in the right. That's me on Twitter and stuff. And if you want to read more, my book is coming out probably in 2021. Thank you very much. I think we're having some questions. Do I need to give you a microphone, Dasha? Someone's got one. It's okay. Am I being the compere myself? Very good. Okay. Does anyone have a question? Can we have the house lights up? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, in a lot of countries, you get a letter from the president, I believe, when you have your 100th birthday.
Yeah.
Is that right?
In the UK, we get a telegram from the Queen, because we're archaic
Right,
like that.
right. Okay, whatever. It's like a matter of pick your poison, right? Anyways, how many people generally can be labeled as centenarians, and is there anything special about them from a biological standpoint?
It's a very interesting question. The number of centenarians is actually the fastest growing segment of the population, because as people are living longer, it's getting more and more likely that these extremely unlikely things will happen. But it's a very strange thing to get your head around, because 100's a nice round number, and it's sort of achievable for humans, but it's actually very, very unlikely. The chances, if we look around this room, there's probably less than 100 of us in here, so maybe 1 or 2 of us will make it to the age of 100, given current death rates. Now, life expectancy is going up all the time, so actually the younger people in the audience have got a better chance. But even still, it's a very, very rare thing to happen. And it's a very good question as to whether there's anything special about them. The answer is probably yes, but it's quite hard to work out what it is. So the genetic contribution to aging, so if you look at how old your parents were and try and use it to work out how long you're going to live, turns out to be incredibly small, except in the case where you have exceptional longevity in the family. So if your parents or your grandparents have made it to 90 or 95 or 100, or even better, they're called supercentenarians if they make it to 110, then your odds of making it to those same ages are dramatically improved. So there's clearly something genetic going on, but we don't know exactly what it is. There are a few genes we've identified that seem to be related to the process, but we haven't explained exactly what it is yet. Okay. So there are certainly a population that's really interesting to study, because they've got some secrets that we haven't fully unlocked.
Great. I was going to go for a second one.
Yeah.
So, say you don't really make much progress, which is has been the case for scientists in the past. They try to cure aging, haven't really got much progress in that regard. Would you consider cryogenics in hopes that in the future there's going to be more smarter people who are going to be able to figure something out?
Yeah, I think I'm quite optimistic about it. So the nerds will call it cryonics rather than cryogenics, to distinguish between low temperature science and effectively cooling people down. And honestly, I just get my brain frozen, because by the time they can wake up a frozen dead brain, they can probably build me a new body at the same time as well, by the time science is that far advanced. I think this is something that's really fascinating. And actually, the reason I didn't include it in my book is more because of the social stigma associated with it. I mean, apart from the fact my book is already too long and it doesn't need any more material. But there's a huge social stigma attached to it. People think you're mad, and scientists think you're mad if you talk about cryonics. But it's actually a massive ethical challenge, because the philosopher I spoke to when I was talking about the ethics of aging, he says, when someone dies, a library burns. You've got all the knowledge and experience and relationships of that person just immediately disappear into nothing. And if you then get cremated or you get stuck in the ground to be eaten by the worms, that information is completely gone forever. Whereas if you can preserve someone's brain frozen in a state where the chemical reactions are happening incredibly slowly, there's quite good evidence that maybe that information could be preserved. We obviously can't be sure, because we've never woken anyone up. But given how much it costs to cryopreserve brains, I wonder if we're committing a terrible ethical atrocity that future generations will look back on us and say, why did you barbarians not freeze all the brains of the people that you couldn't save? So yeah, it's a fascinating question.
Thank you.
Maybe if I stick with the subject of the brain, because it seemed to me that a lot of your talk alluded to diseases associated with aging that affect other parts of our body. And the brain's very different in terms of its cell reproductions. And what can we really slow down that general degradation of our grey matter?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. And I think the reason is that you're right to say the brain is different. And one thing that's particularly different about the brain is that, for example, your neurons almost never divide. You have a lot of neurons in your brain that you've had since you were born, or since before you were born, in fact. So they do suffer from slightly different sort of... They suffer from the same kind of damage, but different... in different proportions. So the neurons, which almost never divide, suffer from kinds of damage that other cells, like the cells in your skin or the cells in your liver, your intestine or something, that are constantly dividing, they won't suffer from those same kinds of damage. But the great thing about that list of 9 things that I put up there is, it is really fundamental. All cells basically share a lot of those same characteristics. And it seems very likely that whenever we do come up with treatments for them, the brain will be affected as well. And you can really see that with the senolytic treatments. So I said that the mice are more curious when you give them these senolytics. And it's also been noticed that so your brain isn't just neurons. There are loads of other kinds of cell in there as well. there's a sort of supporting load of cells called the glia, and senescent glial cells are thought to be implicated in diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So there might well be trials for senolytic drugs in those conditions too. So I really think that whilst body and brain are considered quite separate, in terms of the way that they age, there's more in common than we think.
If I may, one more question. What's your opinion about hormones and the use of hormone supplementary therapy in sort of, I don't know, increasing as we're getting older, giving us chaps a bit more testosterone, etc., and beneficial aspects of that?
Yeah, I actually don't know a great deal about testosterone, and hormone replacement therapy in women is a really mixed bag, because I think I'm right in saying this, please don't quote me on this, but I think I'm right in saying that although it improves your aging in some ways, it also massively increases risk of breast and ovarian cancer. We've got some nods down here from some people who know what they're talking about. So it changes your aging in one way, but doesn't in another. And I think you've got to be very careful when you look at changes that happen in the aging body and think that just because something goes down, it'll be better if we pushed it up. Because sometimes, biology isn't completely stupid. Some of those changes are beneficial. And I think a really good example is growth hormone. So some people use growth hormone to bodybuild, basically, to build muscle. And it's been suggested that you might give growth hormone to older people to try and restore some of the muscle strength that they've lost. But it's a really dangerous game because one of the best, in fact, the longest-lived mice are growth hormone mutants. And they either don't produce growth hormone or they don't produce the little receptors on the surface of the cell that detect the growth hormone, which means they're basically blind to growth hormone. Those mice live about 50 or 60% longer than normal mice. And there's even an analogue in humans. There's a group of people somewhere in Central America, or maybe South America, who are also missing the growth hormone gene. And they're all quite short in stature. And unfortunately, we don't know if it improves their aging massively because there's terrible problems with alcoholism in that population. So they all die of liver failure before they have a chance to get any of the age-related diseases. But yes, to cut a long story short, it's really difficult to look at these things and go, growth hormone goes down in age, maybe we should give more. Because actually, looking at the sort of whole life perspective, it looks quite likely that growth hormone overall is a bad thing. So it's really, really difficult to tease out stuff about hormones, I think.
Maybe perhaps I can do it without the microphone? Oh, God. Well, I thought it was super interesting,
thank you.
All of it. I would say, though, that, we govern our lives in a certain way. And when you introduce preventive treatment, right, what happens to accountability? That would really concern me, because I think we need to be responsible.
Yeah.
Many of these charts that you cite, I don't know how people can, differentiate from self-inflicted diseases or age-related diseases, right? I think it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, and so when you say self-inflicted, do you mean if people don't exercise or they smoke too much?
Yeah, drinking, smoking, there are so many different things that we can do to ourselves that are not that good for us, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think then happens there? Who owns that one?
I think that we should try and treat people whatever's wrong with them and however they've come by that problem. And actually what's interesting about things like drinking and smoking and overeating, they all seem to effectively, not in every single exact detail, but they just accelerate the aging process. So for example, in smoking, there's a huge increase in the amount of DNA damage you get in the tissue in your lungs. And so the same kinds of therapies that we come up to deal with DNA damage in other parts of the body are going to work on lungs in smokers. Now, that doesn't mean I recommend that you all go out and smoke as much as you want because science is going to come and save you. We're living at a period in history where this stuff is very much under development, and every extra year you live could mean you get access to a new anti-aging treatment that makes you live even longer. So please stay as healthy as possible in order to get access to as much medicine as you can. The first part of your question about sort of accountability and prevention, I think that's really crucially important because I feel like I'm a nerd, right? I'm a scientist. I've been reading about this stuff for ages, and I don't feel that I'm in a position to make the call. For example, if I was a bit older, I might think about taking metformin. I know some people who are in their 40s and 50s who have started taking metformin, even though all the evidence isn't in yet. And it puts you in a fascinating... it puts individuals in the position of making quite a fascinating and morbid calculation. So when I'm 65, I'll have if nothing's changed, I'll have a 1% chance every year of dying. And I guess I'm a bit of a techno-optimist. I might be willing to roll the dice and have a treatment that gives me, say, a 0.5% chance of death if I think it will improve my chance of life in the long run, because I've already got a 1% chance of death just by being alive. So I think trying to do this calculation is really, really challenging for individuals. And I think we're going to have to do a lot of training of doctors, because doctors don't currently know anything about the aging process. They're all, there's oncologists, there's cardiologists, they deal with very specific silos of age-related disease, and there's almost nobody involved in looking over the whole of, sort of the human condition. And secondly, none of them have received any training in dispensing these preventative drugs because they don't exist yet. So that's going to be a big thing. But I also think that scientists and governments have a real responsibility to the citizens of the countries to explain, what the options are, what the risks are, what the benefits are, so that people can come to an individual decision. Because if you're an optimist like me and you're 65 and you're thinking, oh God, I'm starting to climb the exponential part of that graph, I'm willing to take a bit of a risk. Whereas someone else who's a bit more conservative might think, well, I don't want to try this until every single trial has been done, all the T's have been crossed and the I's have been dotted. So it's just a question, I think, of providing people with information, but it is very hard.
Thank you. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about mental health and well-being and where that fits in with all this. Because in the UK, I think we've recently started to realise that we've got a big problem with loneliness among older people. And thinking about populations in the world where people do live a long time, some of those are places where community is very close. So I'd be interested in your views.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important. And I'm, as the sort of science I'm interested in is very focused on the sort of molecules and cells and drugs and that sort of thing. But you're absolutely right that community and belonging are an incredibly important thing in terms of when people die. There's a terrifying correlation. If your life partner dies, you will often die fairly shortly afterwards, even if you weren't necessarily particularly unhealthy, just because of the sort of the grief and the loneliness that entails. So we clearly need greater support structures. This is slightly dodging the question, but I'm going to do it anyway. In that I feel that the most important thing that I can do and the most important thing that a lot of us can do is to look at the science. And that isn't because I'm ignoring all the social consequences, but it's because fundamentally the reason that people become lonely is because their friends die, or it's because their friends become too ill to go out and do the activities they used to do together. And so if people were living longer, healthier lives for longer, then some of these problems, not all of them by any means, but some of them would start to disappear. And I definitely think that's an issue. Another really big social issue that I haven't talked about at all is inequality of lifespan. So the poorest people in the UK, there's a fascinating statistic that if you travel across the river on the Victoria line, which is one of the tube lines in London, in 4 stops, life expectancy changes by over 10 years. Because you go from Green Park in central London, which is where Buckingham Palace is, just to give you an idea of how wealthy a region it is, all the way to Vauxhall, which is south of the river, a little bit poorer. Life expectancy goes from like 80s to 78. So clearly that's a huge thing that needs to be addressed. I will shout about that as much as I can, but I really think that the technical fix to this is if we give everybody access, we've got an NHS, we can give everybody these drugs, and then you can start to solve these problems of inequality by sidestepping them and doing them with science. So yeah, really hard social problems, needs to do something about it, but I think that the place I can be of most benefit is to try and fix the science. That's my plan.
Thank you for the presentation. Actually, that's what I wanted to ask you about, the social inequality. Let's talk about money. Who can afford these treatments? Yeah. And second of all, if only the rich can afford it, wouldn't that increase the social inequality around the world and create even more problems in the long term? Yeah. It's a very good question. What's your possible solution for this other than NHS? Or because we know governments and other organisms don't necessarily mean the best for the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did worry about this. The first thing to say about the idea that only the rich will have access to it is that it's mutually exclusive with the population problem. So you can't have a problem with overpopulation if only a handful of mega billionaires are taking your drugs. And that's something that people often do when they're thinking about these ethical challenges. They hold multiple contradictory beliefs simultaneously. But to answer your question, which is really important, I think the best way to look at it is to look at the most expensive medical treatments that are currently available. And a good example of this is something called CAR T-cell therapy, which is a kind of cancer treatment where you extract someone's immune cells, you genetically modify them outside of the body, then you inject them back into the patient, and those cells then chase after the cancer and get rid of it. And this is one of the most exciting things in cancer research because they're actually curing cancers in children that have previously been incurable. So that's really amazing. This is a hugely labor-intensive process because you have to extract the thing, you take it to the lab, a load of really highly trained scientists do all this stuff with the genes, then they take it over here and someone tests it to make sure it's all safe before they inject it back in the patient. And famously, I've forgotten the name of the treatment, but one of the treatments in the US costs $500,000, and that's just for the injection. It doesn't include all the care that goes around it. But the US health system, as you probably know, is quite dysfunctional. And if you strip it back to the actual cost of that treatment costs in the high 5-figure dollars, so it might cost like $60,000 to $90,000 to actually do. And this is a treatment. There's a fantastic article I read by a US cancer doctor explaining how CAR T-cell therapy works. And because it's a regulated medicine, when they're over here in the lab dripping these chemicals, there is literally a fully trained lab technician dripping them. There is another fully trained lab tech, probably got a Ph.D, stood there counting the number of drops to make sure they're following the protocol. This is hilariously inefficient, just crying out to be done by robots. And so the way that I think about this is a very long-winded answer. The way that I think about this is the most expensive current medical treatments being done in the most ridiculous, human labour-intensive, mad way in the most dysfunctional drug market in the world only, in inverted commas, cost, say, $50,000 to actually do. If we can drag that cost down, so it's only costing a few $1,000s per treatment, which doesn't seem crazy, then that's the most expensive a therapy could possibly be. And given the trillions of dollars we're leaving lying on the table, we can totally afford to pay for it for everybody. In fact, any government that didn't give anti-aging treatment to its whole population would be committing economic suicide. So I think it's going to turn out to be okay.
But then, I will agree with that. But then actually, this kind of brings me to the thought of... Yes, they can. It just brings me to this thought of, is the world a kind enough place to accommodate all of this? Because when you think of the poverty lines, right, and the situations that people are in, you extend their life cycle for what? To suffer more?
I'm much more optimistic than you.
You are? Oh, I'm so glad.
No, it's okay. And I think it's down to a misconception that a lot of people hold. You're certainly not unique in having it, but the world is a much better place than a lot of us think. Poverty is falling across any measure you care to choose. And inequality of life expectancy is a really great example. If you look back in the 1950s, the countries with the lowest life expectancy were like 30 or 40 years, and we in the West were up in the 70s. Whereas today, there's, I think, only 1% of the world's population live in countries where the life expectancy is below 65. So that equality is really squashed up. The low-income countries are catching us up very rapidly. That's not to say there's not a problem. Absolutely not. But for all its ills, capitalism and everything has massively increased the wealth in the world, and it's the poor who've benefited the most. Even though we hear a lot of headlines about billionaires and the super rich, actually, the wealth of developing countries is coming up incredibly, incredibly quickly. That isn't to say that we shouldn't concentrate on malaria, we shouldn't concentrate on neglected tropical diseases. Those are hugely important too. But there are only a handful of countries where the majority of deaths aren't caused by aging. So I actually think this is a global equality issue in itself. Does that answer your question? No.
Hi, so Andrew Fering, thank you for coming to Prague. It was so interesting. Okay, so my question goes to something which is called biohacking. Mm-hmm. So do you have more views on that? And also, I am already in my second third of my life, mm-hmm. So I am starting doing a lot of things, to prevent all these medicines and stuff. So what is your view on taking high doses on vitamin C? A lot of people are doing it, and other things like beta-glucans, carnosine, and stuff like that.
What were the last two, sorry?
Beta-glucans. 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 Yeah, beta-glucans, glucans, and
mm-hmm.
carnosine.
Yeah.
Carnosine,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you can elaborate a little bit on that.
What was the first question?
Was the biohacking.
Oh, biohacking, yes, thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, I think biohacking is fascinating, but we're not quite at the stage where we're ready to do it yet. So there's actually a woman in the States called Liz Parrish who started a company to give people extra copies of genes, so to effectively do gene editing. And she's done this treatment on herself. So she started out effectively biohacking. She's given herself, I think, extra telomerase. And what's the other thing? She's given herself something else, something, because it's to do with myostatin, thank you, yes. Myostatin, which is to do with growth of muscles. And I think she's crazy. Like, she's done this far before the science warrants it. And it's certainly not time to do it. And I really think this isn't something that individuals should be taking into their own hands, because the expertise you need to try and understand all the complicated results and all the, for example, with the telomerase, the competing risk of cancer, there's loads and loads of stuff to try and integrate. So I think it's fascinating. The main thing I hope in terms of the individual biohackers is that we actually get some useful data out of them. So the real problem is that they're conducting these sort of N=1 trials, as scientists sarcastically call them, where we've got one unique person doing something really bizarre. I just hope that we can actually encourage these people who are willing to experiment on themselves to be part of bigger trials so that we can actually get some useful data and work out what's going to be a benefit to the general population. In terms of vitamin supplements, the answer is much simpler: don't bother. there was a huge amount of interest in it in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, when a guy proposed that free radicals might be the cause of aging. But we've discovered since that actually free radicals are vital messaging molecules in the body. There have been loads of experiments, both in mice and large human trials, which have shown that people who take vitamin C, vitamin A, vitamin E, all these different supplements, don't live any longer. In fact, vitamin E, they might live less time. And the reason is our bodies, free radicals, which are these chemicals that were proposed to be the cause of aging, they've been around since the dawn of life. Like the very first cells had to deal with free radicals. So our biology has learned very well how to make sure the levels stay optimum. So if you take an antioxidant like vitamin C, which is designed to soak up the free radicals, your body will produce more to compensate because it needs those free radicals in a certain concentration. So as long as you're getting a healthy, balanced diet, you know, plenty of fruit and veg and all the boring stuff I'm sure you already know, just don't bother with vitamin supplements. It's cheaper.
Okay, I got a question. First of all, thanks. It was quite mind-blowing as a speech. And then the question is, assuming, being optimist like you are, I mean, like assuming that you are outside any ethical questions, because this is not in your field anyway, and assuming that you are very successful, and in 2025 you cure aging or you stop aging forever. At which age will you stop aging? So will you stop people growing older when they are 10 because they learn languages extremely fast? Or will you stop them when they are 20 or 25 or 30? I mean, like, and why would you choose that or the other, like,
that's a really good question.
And in the second part, do you see problem with brain capacity? So if you live so many more years, but you are still limited to 5, 10%, whatever brain capacity, and already now I cannot store anything that you said, but how would you solve that problem? I mean, like.
So in answer to the first question, I think we're not going to have a choice at first, but what's probably going to happen is, you know, say I start deleting senescent cells, then you're going to want to delete those senescent cells down to get them to a level that they are in a young person. And as you say, young person is quite a sort of loose category. Your 20s is probably the best place to be, because when you're 10, you're still undergoing development, so your body's got quite a lot of changes going on inside it. What we want to get is to a state where the body is just static. Talking about language learning, this is completely outside the field of aging, but you could imagine that perhaps if we can work out what makes your brain more plastic and, you know, gives you that ability, maybe we could address that separately. But I'd be happy to have the brain of a 25-year-old, even, you know, let alone my 34-year-old old fogey brain. The second question, memory. I think it won't be too much of a problem. And the reason I think that is actually precisely because of what you say, because you just forget stuff. So some people ask, you know, if we lived a really long time, wouldn't we just get clogged up with all these memories of 1,000 years of life or something? But honestly, I can't really remember my first day at university in a huge amount of detail. I certainly can't remember my first day at work in a huge amount of detail. And I just think, you know, those are quite significant life events. I certainly can't remember, you know, the 25th of January 2007 in any great deal of detail. And I think we just have this sort of rolling window of memory that follows us through life. So I'm not too worried as long as, you know, the stuff that I forget is long enough ago. And I think our personalities and memories and so on are constantly changing. So I'll be really fascinated to see what happens, but I haven't got an answer because we haven't got any 300-year-old people to ask.
Okay, may I have a question too?
Yeah, of course.
Before we have the treatment available and before we all are rich enough to afford it, what would you recommend? Give us the summary what we should do in our daily approach to life.
Good question. Very high science talk, very low health advice. But the reason that I don't talk much about health advice is it's all really boring. All the stuff that we know is going to work. Don't be overweight. Being overweight is really bad. I can explain the science of why, but basically don't be overweight. Try and keep your BMI below 25. There's another better measure, which is called waist to height ratio. So you want to make sure the distance around your waist is less than half of how tall you are. If you can keep that ratio, you're doing really well. You don't have too much visceral fat. Visceral fat is bad, makes you age faster. Do loads of exercise. Exercise is so important. And it doesn't matter how old you are, no matter how late you start, this will always be a benefit. I read some fascinating studies where they gave 90-year-olds resistance training, so the sort of training where you lift weights and that sort of stuff. And they got stronger over a period of weeks and months. Doesn't matter how old you are, make sure you're doing cardiovascular and resistance training, because a lot of that decrease in muscle strength that happens in late life is optional. As long as you keep on doing the exercise, it won't happen to you. Do not smoke. I cannot emphasize enough how little you should smoke. It's terrible. It'll knock about 10 years off your life, and as soon as you stop, it stops accruing this terrible damage. That's really bad news. Don't drink too much. You're not too sure about that. Just don't go crazy. Make sure you get plenty of fruit and veg. Wear sun cream, because the UV light in sunlight causes damage to the DNA in the cells of your skin. A lot of skin scientists I've spoken to say that skin aging is basically sun damage entirely. And they do these crazy experiments where they measure the properties of a piece of skin, say from your arm or your face, which is commonly exposed to the sun the whole time. They then have to find a piece of your body that isn't exposed to your sun much. A lot of the studies choose the bum. So unless you're a nude sunbather, that's quite an accurate control. And when they measure the differences between those two types of skin, this skin is much younger because it hasn't been exposed to all that UV. So wear sun cream and have a lovely young bum. Is there anything? Oh, brush your teeth. That's another slightly random one, because the bacteria on the surface of your teeth are thought to secrete inflammatory molecules that basically accelerate the aging process. So everything I've told you just then is incredibly boring basic health advice that I'm sure your mum and your teachers and your doctor have told you over and over again, but it's all true. Do it. I've got a lot more health conscious writing this book.
So you mentioned about how many times you've been questioned about the overpopulation, but what about the increasing unemployment rate? As you know, like, the technology has been so advanced that many jobs have been replaced by robots, and if we can cure aging, wouldn't that people would be less likely to retire, which means there would be less job for younger people, which lead to some sort of problems. What do you think about this?
I'm really not worried, and the reason I'm not worried is because of that idea falls prey to something called the lump of labour fallacy, which is a slightly boring economic technical term. It's the same reason that immigration isn't bad for employment. So say in the UK, people come from Europe, for example, topical, slightly controversial. People are coming from Europe because of freedom of movement. They settle in the UK, they start having a job. Are they stealing the locals' jobs? Well, the answer is no, because they're working, they're earning money, they're then spending that money in the rest of the economy. So that means they're generating new jobs at the same time. And that means that local British people are able to do more work. Because, the people who have come from Europe, they have to eat food, they have to live in a house, they have to sit on a sofa and sleep in a bed. So all of these things increase economic activity. And it's exactly the same as people get older and hang on to their jobs, because they're wealthier, they're contributing to the economy. It's going to grow the economy overall. So I think there's a really... There probably will be changes as people get older and start claiming their pensions later. But honestly, because they're contributing to the economy, it should mean the whole economy gets bigger and unemployment doesn't change a great deal.
Any more questions?
Já bohužel neumím dobře anglicky. Německy bych se domluvil, ale on to někdo může přeložit.
No, sorry. But if you ask in Czech, Dasha can translate for me, right?
Takže moje otázka zní, co soudíte o čínských experimentech s poličťováním opic, případně dělají experiment na rozvoj jejich mozku, aby se podobal tomu lidskému. A v této souvislosti zdá se, že nemají žádné morálně etické zábrany tihle experimentátoři. Jezdí tam i vědci ze západu na ty experimenty. A zdá se, že alternativní cestou přes tu technologii CRISP, přesné editace genů, by bylo možné dosáhnout i dokonalé opravy těch buněk a tím pádem dosáhnout jejich nesmrtelnosti.
Okay, I got experimenty, which I'm guessing I can understand, and CRISP, which I think might be a key for any scientists in the room.
CRISP technology, if this is the way how to get to the perfect life and long life, and the other thing was about the ethics of running some experiments in China on monkeys, trying to make them into more like humans, and I hope I covered it. Yeah. Yeah. If through CRISP you can get the immortal individual beings, but I think you should make the difference between aging and dying.
Yeah, so I think CRISPR is an amazing technology in labs at the moment, but it's not yet ready for the prime time in people. And the reason is, so what CRISPR is, it's an enzyme that was found in bacteria, and it can look through your DNA, and it can find a particular word in the DNA, and at that location it can cut. And the reason that's really useful in the lab is that you can give it to a cell, goes in, cuts the DNA, and it breaks the DNA in that place. And scientists love breaking things and seeing what happens. That's like the way that we work. So they go in, they break the gene, they see what changes, and they can work out what that gene does. The problem is that a lot of the ways that we can try and improve aging by changing genes, we don't just have to break them, we have to change them in a really specific way. So that means that CRISPR isn't enough. We need to have a more advanced technology probably based on CRISPR. And things are moving in that direction, but we don't know yet. What was the other thing I was going to say about CRISPR? Oh, I've completely forgotten. In terms of off target, yes. This guy, you can come to all my talks. Yeah, I was going to mention that CRISPR isn't 100% effective at finding the right spelling in the DNA, so it can just cut in a few random places. I had a colleague actually who was looking into this, and they found that CRISPR targeted at one particular DNA sequence had up to 400 off-target cuts in other parts of the genome, so it's pretty messy. Again, it's fine in the lab. I'm not sure I'd do it at home if you're a biohacker. As for experiments to make monkeys more like people, I'm afraid I've not even heard of that, but it doesn't sound ethical at all. That's my opinion. The Chinese attitude to CRISPR, I mean, I say the Chinese attitude, it was one scientist. I don't know if you've heard about the experiment that was done on an unborn baby. They got the egg cell and they used CRISPR to try and cut a gene they think will increase its resistance to HIV. This wasn't Chinese government policy, I should hasten to add. They've condemned it. But the individual Chinese scientist who did it has just been ostracized by the whole scientific community because it's not known. He didn't do proper checks to make sure that the gene edit had occurred where he thought it had, and then he let these babies be born. It's just completely irresponsible. So, yeah, we certainly have to watch out. Now sort of biotechnology and things like CRISPR are getting so easy that you can do them in your garage. We do have to make sure that we keep it with the ethics so people aren't doing mad, unethical stuff at home.
Right, Andrew, thank you so much. I mean, it's been a great discussion. It's been some really interesting questions, and I think we've all got quite a lot to think about going away. It's been brilliant. Can I have another round of applause, please, for Andrew?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.